Thank you for returning to complete this lecture. This is part 2 of a lecture on the 1980s. In part 1, we looked at Reagan's early career and his rise to the presidency as well as his domestic policy. For the second part, we will examine some of the aspects of his foreign policy and conclude the topic. Americans heard President Reagan say this after someone forgot to cut the transmission for a mic check. My fellow Americans, I'm pleased to announce that I've signed legislation outlawing the Soviet Union. We begin bombing in 5 minutes. Now, this was just a joke. And while it was a joke, the winning of the Cold War was a major feature of the Reagan presidency. But fighting the communists got more complicated in the 1980s. Overall, Ronald Reagan made the Cold War as close to hot as it had been during the early days of John Kennedy. He ratcheted up the rhetoric and the military spending, presenting a threat to Russia in words and bombs. This, along with other actions, were part of how Reagan's administration crafted a strong American image. For example, on January 20, 1981, Reagan announced that the American hostages taken in Iran during Carter's term would be released after 444 days in captivity. His administration used this moment to fit the conservative narrative that they could do what liberals could not, assert U.S. strength and protect national security. Was it true? It does not matter if it was true or not. Americans were happy to see America stand up to the bad guys. Things were not so clear with the IranContra affair. Early in 1986, news leaked that the administration had negotiated an arms for hostage deal with the Revolutionary Islamic government of Iran. For years, the president had denounced Iran as an outlaw state and a supporter of terrorism. But in 1985, he allowed the sale of arms to the outlaw state to get help in freeing some hostages held by Hezbollah, a pro-Iranian Shiite group in Lebanon. This was a secret arms deal which was diplomatically and politically controversial, but it did not end there. Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North of the U.S. Marines used the profits from this arms deal to fund the resistance to the Sandinista government in Nicaragua. So who were the Sandinistas? Reagan's administration disliked the Sandinista government in Nicaragua for pursuing socialist policies that were detrimental to American business interests and forming a military alliance with Cuba's Fidel Castro. Reagan had ordered the CIA to aid the resistance to the Sandinista government known as the Contras. But after the Korean War, Vietnam War debacles, Congress wanted to maintain a hold on its war-making powers and banned the CIA from supporting the Contras by 1984. So without regard to this ban, Oliver North continued helping the Contras with the Iranian arms profits. When asked under oath about Reagan's knowledge of North's activities, he replied, "I don't know." Reagan's supporters assumed innocence, his detractors figured he was lying, but now we cannot know with the revelation that he might have already had the symptoms of Alzheimer's affecting his memory. If he was innocent, he was guilty only for the Iran part. Nonetheless, this did not help his popularity, and people were shocked about the dealings with Iran. He proposed no new domestic policy initiatives in his last years due to his weakened standing. Since Nixon, the U.S. had followed a policy of détente regarding the USSR, which meant relaxed tensions. But as Reagan entered office, he proclaimed, "The West won't contain communism, it will transcend communism." The administration pursued a two-pronged strategy to defeat the Russians. First, it abandoned détente and started rearming America. Caspar Weinberger argued that the arms race would strain the Russian economy and cause domestic unrest. Second, the president supported the initiatives of CIA Director William Casey. Casey sought to roll back Soviet influence in the Third World by funding guerrillas who were trying to overthrow pro-communist governments in Angola, Mozambique, Afghanistan, and Central America. This included Nicaragua. This was known as the Reagan Doctrine. Let's discuss the Afghanistan example since it relates to our problems in the Middle East today. On December 27, 1979, Soviet troops invaded Afghanistan, which happened during Carter's term. This concerned Carter as it seemed to be a move by the Russians to control much of the world's oil supplies. Carter imposed economic sanctions against the Russians and canceled American participation in the 1980 Summer Olympics being held in Moscow. But the real problem was Reagan's. Remember, he was president starting in 1981, and now historians and others are examining his administration's role there and its consequences. The newest research demonstrates that the CIA, the KGB, and several other nations' agencies all operated directly and secretly in Afghanistan. They directed cash and weapons to Afghan factions and secretly trained the guerrilla forces. In the midst of the struggles, Osama bin Laden conceived and built of his global organization. It wasn't until Reagan's takeover that things heated up in Afghanistan, which moved his administration to act. Under Bill Casey, the CIA helped fund and arm the Mujahideen of Afghanistan. The term Mujahideen basically means strugglers or people doing jihad. Jihad refers to several types of struggles faced by Muslims, including something as personal as holding on to their faith, but in this case it meant to defend Islam. And this jihad was focused on the pro-Soviet government known as the Democratic Republic of Afghanistan. Communists didn't have much love for religion, so it might make sense that some Afghans might see the takeover of Afghanistan by Russian communists as contradictory to their needs. Not to mention the fact that the Soviet invasion may have killed as many as 2 million Afghanis. By funding this group, the Americans and their allies there were supporting the guerrillas so they could harass Soviet occupation forces and hopefully drive them out. The U.S. worked with the Saudis and the Pakistanis to do this, and the Pakistanis were the ones who chose who to fund, the Mujahideen. Their intelligence service agents believed that the radical Islamist factions, this particular one, was the best suited to fight the Russians. The CIA really didn't care who fought the anti-Soviet jihad and didn't care about local politics. This was an anti-Soviet mission. The problem was that at some point the Mujahideen were going to turn their jihad from the ousted Soviets to the Americans, which may have started in the late 1980s. Scholars are still doing their work, but an estimated amount somewhere between $3 billion and $20 billion in U.S. funds were funneled into the country to train and equip radical Afghani troops with weapons, including Stinger surface-to-air missiles. Some media reports claim up to $40 billion. Some also argue that Osama bin Laden was allegedly among the recipients of U.S. arms. While this is all disputed, it demonstrates how connected the current events of al-Qaeda were to the events of the 1980s. Ronald Reagan praised the Mujahideen as freedom fighters. In 1983, Reagan said, quote, "To watch the courageous Afghan freedom fighters battle modern arsenals with simple handheld weapons is an inspiration to those who love freedom," end quote. And the Mujahideen militants were portrayed positively in several 1980s films, including The Living Daylights, a 1980s James Bond film, and Rambo 3 in 1988. Yet it was becoming clear to people in the State Department that the United States should not be funding extremists who hate Americans. By the time this information was known, it was too late. Thus, in the name of the Cold War, the Reagan administration supported terrorists who eventually attacked the United States. There are so many other interesting foreign policy and Cold War issues that we could explore, but we just don't have time. If you're interested, look into Grenada, Lebanon, and El Salvador for other examples. But for now, we need to deal with the Soviet Union. In Reagan's first term, Reagan called Russia the evil empire and increased military spending. But by his second term, he decided the goal was to actively cooperate with Russia's newest leader, Mikhail Gorbachev, who was reform-minded. You can see the two of them standing here in this picture. Some argue that Reagan had ended the Cold War, but the collapse of the USSR was the result of both external pressure from the US and internal weaknesses of the Soviet economy. Some historians even argue that the Afghanistan War was as disastrous to the Soviet Union as the Vietnam War had been for the United States. External pressure came with the heating up of the Cold War in places such as the ones mentioned previously. The Reagan administration certainly put pressure on Russia, especially in places such as Afghanistan, but the fall of the USSR would not have happened without the leadership of Russia's premier, Mikhail Gorbachev, who promoted two new ideas for the Soviet Union: glasnost, which meant openness, or more broadly interpreted, an end of repressive mechanisms in the country, and then also perestroika. This meant reform. In this case, this was more economic, restructuring the rigid and unproductive economy. For the first time, Russians were allowed to participate in capitalist ventures, but to date, Russia is still reeling from 70 years of communist dictators. With the rise of Putin, there's new problems, but we don't know how that's going to shake out yet because those are current events. By 1989, every communist state in Europe, Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Bulgaria, East Germany, Yugoslavia, and Albania either overthrew its government or forced it to transform into a non-communist or anti-communist regime. The same type of movement occurred in China, but failed and led to a massacre at Tiananmen Square. But communist China was not a satellite of Russia. Of course, the tearing down of the Berlin Wall was the most visible sign that the Russia we had known, our Cold War enemy for 40 years, was disappearing. In November 1989, millions of television viewers worldwide watched as Germans tore down the wall. For some, Reagan is a demigod, for others not so much. So Reagan's legacy can be interpreted in many ways. I have tried to give you some nonpartisan ideas to think about here. After Reagan, it has been impossible for Democrats to propose the kind of programs that had defined their party since the New Deal. In 1992, Bill Clinton said, quote, "The era of big government is over," end quote, which was a stunning statement for a Democrat to make. So we do see an end to the liberal era. In many ways, Reagan is considered the father of modern conservatism. But did he change the electorate? There was not a massive realignment of voters like there was with FDR. The Reagan Democrats failed to stick with the conservatives, and the only big switch was a final conversion of Southern Democrats into Southern Republicans. But that had more to do with LBJ than it did Ronald Reagan. More than anything else, Reagan made Americans proud of their country again. We felt strong as a nation militarily, even if the economy was not great for everyone. With the gap between the rich and the poor growing, Reagan received criticisms. One cartoonist called him Reaganhood, portraying him as one who stole from the poor and gave to the rich. 6 million more people were living in poverty. Yet, despite that and other facts to failures in his term, criticisms did not seem to hurt his reputation. Representative Patricia Schroeder called him the Teflon president because nothing stuck to him. That is the end of our lecture for today. Thank you for joining me. I hope that this information will help you in your studies. We all hope to see you at PNC when you are done with your high school degree.